The autumn air in St. Mildred's was crisp and mellow, carrying with it the faint tang of wood smoke and the scent of late roses clinging bravely to their vines. The village was one of those peculiarly English places that looked as though it had been lifted straight from an illustrated book. A square with its duck pond, a Norman church with a weathered tower, and a high street that offered everything from millinery to meat pies. Though on a scale small enough to comfort rather than overwhelmed, it was here, on the corner of the high street and just opposite the churchyard, that Frobisher's Bookshop stood, a narrow, somewhat gloomy establishment, with tall windows stacked with second-hand volumes. The shop was something of a curiosity. Its dark oak shelves sagged beneath the weight of decades, if not centuries, of bindings. Within, the faint smell of paper, ink, and dust created an atmosphere that delighted bibliophiles and daunted those with less patience. On that particular Thursday afternoon, the shop was busier than usual, owing to a special exhibition that Mr. Henry Frobisher, the proprietor, had arranged. Rare first editions from country estates, collectors, enthusiasts, and the village's more curious residents had gathered to inspect volumes said to include a Shakespeare folio, a signed Dickens, and a medieval psalter. But Miss Jane Marple, spinster of St. Mary Mead, had journeyed by motorbus to St. Mildred's at the invitation of her old friend, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who had heard of the event and insisted it would make a charming little outing. Miss Marple, wrapped in a neat grey coat with a pale pink scarf tucked at her throat, had agreed with her usual mild courtesy, though she admitted inwardly she was far more interested in observing the assembled personalities than in the rare tomes. Among the crowd gathered in the narrow aisles of the shop were several figures who soon made themselves notable. Mr. Henry, the proprietor, a fastidious, somewhat nervous man in his late 50s, who wore pince-nez and continually polished them with a handkerchief, as though the very act reassured him. Mrs. Agatha Prowse, the vicar's wife, a woman with a sharp chin, an even sharper tongue, who seemed more intent on noting who attended than on the books themselves. Colonel Basil Arbuthnot, retired from the Indian Army, bluff, moustached, and given to pronouncements that brooked no contradiction. He claimed to have a nose for authenticity, though his interests ran more towards brandy than books. Miss Eleanor Harding, a quiet, rather severe-looking woman of 35, who assisted Mr. Frobisher in the shop. She was devoted, efficient, and reputed to know every volume by heart. Mr. Lionel Cresswell, a visiting London dealer, elegant in dress and manner, with a certain air of superiority that made the villagers bristle, even as they hung on his remarks about the worth of this or that edition. The event began pleasantly enough, with Mr. Frobisher offering a brief introduction and ushering his guests to view the display case at the back of the shop, where the rarest works had been placed beneath. Glass, candles in brass holders provided a faintly theatrical light, and heavy velvet curtains draped along the alcove lent an almost stage-like atmosphere. It was then, in the midst of polite murmurs and Colonel Arbuthnot's booming commentary, that something decidedly odd occurred. A rustle behind the curtain was noticed, followed by what seemed a muffled thud. At first, it passed off as nothing more than a shifted box or a falling book. Yet when Miss Harding went to draw back the curtain, she uttered a sharp cry. Behind the drapery, crumpled upon the floorboards, lay Mr. Lionel Cresswell. His face was pale, his eyes closed, and one hand stretched awkwardly toward the fallen candlestick. The murmur of the assembled guests rose to alarm, and Colonel Arbut barked for air. Mrs. Prowse declared it a seizure and demanded water, but Miss Marple, who had stepped forward with quiet determination, noted the stillness of the man's chest and the unnatural bluish tinge about his lips. Mr. Lionel Cresswell was quite dead. The discovery threw the little gathering into chaos. Mr. Frobisher wrung his hands, lamenting that such a dreadful thing should happen in his shop. Miss Harding looked pale but efficient. Rushing to fetch the constable, Mrs. Bantry whispered to Miss Marple that she had never been so near a dead body since the unfortunate affair at Gossington Hall. It was not long before Constable Briggs, a stout, earnest young man, arrived and attempted to take control of the situation. He cleared the shop, though not without protest from Colonel Arbuthnot, who insisted he could spot foul play when he saw it. Miss Marple, meanwhile, seated quietly on a wooden chair near the counter, allowed her eyes to rove gently over the scene. She had noticed, in the confusion, a small overturned glass upon the floor near the curtain. It had contained some liquid, now dried into a faint ring. A peculiar smell lingered faintly, though easily missed in the atmosphere of dust and candle wax. As the constable made his report and sent for the doctor, the guests departed reluctantly, each whispering in anxious tones. Yet, even as the shop emptied, Miss Marple remained thoughtful. She had observed not only the body but also the faces of those present. There had been fear, yes, but in at least 2 instances, she thought, there had been something more, calculation. By the time Dr. Hargreaves, the village physician, arrived to pronounce the death official, it was already clear that Mr. Lionel Cresswell had not succumbed to natural causes. A small bottle, later found tucked behind the counter, contained traces of cyanide. The conclusion was grim but undeniable. Mr. Cresswell had been poisoned, and so the quiet village of St. Mildred's, with its duck pond, church spire, and quaint High Street, found itself the scene of a most sinister mystery. To most, it was a shocking, incomprehensible tragedy. But to Miss Jane Marple, sitting with her knitting in her lap and a pensive expression upon her gentle features, it was something else entirely. She had seen before how malice and ambition, jealousy and revenge, could fester beneath the most respectable of exteriors, and she felt certain, as she reflected on the peculiar circumstances of Mr. Cresswell's death, that the truth lay hidden not in books or rare editions, but in the hearts of the living. The murder behind the bookshop curtain had only just begun to unfold. The news of Mr. Lionel Cresswell's death spread through St. Mildred's with a speed that would have surprised no one familiar with village life. By the next morning, the postmistress knew, the grocer had embroidered, and the vicar's wife had already suggested, over a particularly strong cup of tea, that these London men bring nothing but trouble. Miss Marple, however, was not given to speculation without observation. She had lingered in the village overnight at Dolly Bantry's suggestion, for Mrs. Bantry, though secretly delighted by the excitement, declared she could hardly let her friend go herring back to St. Mary Mead in the middle of a mystery. Thus, the 2 ladies took rooms at the Swan Inn, which overlooked the High Street and provided a clear view of the bookshop. The official inquiry, such as it was, rested with Inspector Craddock from the county town, who arrived that morning to take charge from the earnest but overmatched Constable Briggs. Inspector Craddock, tall and steady-eyed, had dealt with Miss Marple before, and knew better than to dismiss her fluttering manner as mere elderly dithering. He greeted her politely when they met outside the inn, though he added with a wry smile, "Now, Miss Marple, I daresay you'll have the whole thing unravelled before I've finished my paperwork." Miss Marple smiled modestly. "One does notice little things, Inspector, though they are often quite unimportant until one recalls them later." The inspector, with a sigh that betrayed both respect and resignation, set off for the bookshop. Miss Marple, meanwhile, began her own quiet round of conversations, under the innocent guise of friendly chatter. Her first stop was the vicarage, where Mrs. Agatha Proust received her with brisk hospitality and an air of having been unjustly neglected by the centre of events. "Quite shocking, Miss Marple," she declared, pouring tea with a clatter. "Imagine such a thing in our very own bookshop. And on a Thursday too, when I usually go in for magazines." Miss Marple murmured sympathetically, allowing Mrs. Proust to hold forth. She learned, between observations about everyone else's faults, that Mrs. Proust had known Mr. Cresswell by reputation. "A slippery type," she insisted. "All these dealers are always looking to outwit one another. I shouldn't wonder if Mr. Frobisher had been cheated somehow." When Miss Marple asked gently about the gathering itself, Mrs. Proust pursed her lips. "Well, Colonel Arbuthnot was loud as usual. Miss Harding was as stiff as a poker, and poor Mr. Frobisher fluttered about like a hen. If you ask me, it was all rather theatrical. That curtain, for example, completely unnecessary, almost as though someone wanted a hidden corner." Miss Marple nodded, storing the remark carefully. Her next encounter came by chance on the High Street, where Colonel Arbuthnot was booming his version of events to an admiring cluster outside the butcher's. When he saw Miss Marple, he tipped his hat and declared, "Dashed bad show. That fellow had it coming. I dare say these dealers play rough. Poison, was it? Mark my words, it was poison. Smelt something queer myself." Miss Marple, ever polite, asked if he had noticed anything unusual before the death. "Unusual, whole thing was unusual. But if you want particulars, I'll tell you this. Harding, that assistant girl, was hovering about like a cat, and Frobisher looked fit to burst every time Cresswell opened his mouth. fellow was criticizing his collection, saying half the editions were forgeries. Insufferable. What? It was information indeed. Miss Marple listened, nodded, and allowed the Colonel to continue, though inwardly she observed that bluster often accompanied exaggeration. Still, bluster sometimes concealed kernels of truth. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call upon Miss Harding at the bookshop. The young woman looked pale and drawn, yet her hands were steady as she stacked a shelf of novels. It must be terribly distressing, Miss Marple said kindly. Miss Harding hesitated. Yes, Mr. Cresswell was difficult, but he did not deserve. She broke off, then pressed her lips together. Forgive me. It is all very trying. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting bag at her side, as though she were only an elderly friend come to offer comfort. But she observed the flicker in Miss Harding's eyes, the way her fingers tightened on the book spines. You must know the collection very well, Miss Marple remarked. I do. Every volume. Mr. Frobisher relies upon me. Without me, the shop could not manage. And Mr. Cresswell. Miss Harding gave a small, almost involuntary shiver. He was arrogant. He implied he said certain books were false. He threatened to expose them. It would have ruined Mr. Frobisher. Miss Marple nodded gently. She had suspected as much. At last, Miss Marple spoke with the man at the center of it all. Mr. Frobisher looked 10 years older than the day before, his hands trembling as he adjusted his spectacles. My reputation is ruined, he murmured. Poison. In my shop, it will never be the same again. Miss Marple regarded him with kindly eyes. Mr. Frobisher, people will soon forget the scandal, but what they will not forget, I think, is if it is discovered that you had cause to wish Mr. Cresswell gone. His eyes darted to hers, then away. I had no such wish. It is true he was difficult. He accused me of selling questionable editions, but they were genuine. Miss Marple genuine, I assure you. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked gently. Of course, but perhaps others doubted. He gave a long sigh. It is possible even Miss Harding, though loyal, may have wondered. But I tell you, the Shakespeare folio was real. It was a curious insistence, Miss Marple thought. The motive was clearest in Frobisher and Harding. Yet Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime watching human folly, knew that appearances deceived. Greed and jealousy often dressed themselves in righteousness. That as she sipped her evening cocoa, her mind returned again and again to that small, overturned glass and the peculiar smell. It had not been brandy, nor ink. Something acrid, almost metallic. Cyanide, the inspector had said. But how had it been given? A glass offered, a toast perhaps, all slipped, unnoticed during the display. Miss Marple thought of the curtain again. Mrs. Prowse was right. Why the curtain at all? To provide drama, or to provide concealment? The murder had been neatly staged, of that she felt certain, and in neatness there was always design. Outside, the church bells tolled the hour. Within, Miss Marple drew her shawl about her shoulders and gazed into the fire. She had seen enough of human nature to know that one of those respectable villagers had poisoned Lionel Cresswell, and she suspected, quietly and firmly, that the truth would lie not in rare books, but in the rare follies of the human heart. The inquest was held 2 days later in the panelled chamber of the parish hall. It was a subdued affair, attended by nearly everyone in St. Mildred's who could make the excuse. The coroner, a solemn man with a bald head and pince-nez, pronounced what was already known. Lionel Cresswell had died from cyanide poisoning, administered swiftly and effectively. The verdict was left open. But the whisper among the pews and benches was clear. Someone in that bookshop had slipped the poison to him. The inspector made no arrests, but he looked weary as he questioned each witness in turn. Miss Marple sat quietly in the back, her knitting needles clinking gently, her sharp blue eyes missing nothing. She noted how Mr. Frobisher dabbed his brow continually with a damp handkerchief, how Miss Harding's lips remained pressed in a firm line, and how Colonel Arbuthnot twirled his moustache with studied nonchalance. Mrs. Prowse, of course, gave her evidence with an air of martyrdom, as though she herself had been poisoned and heroically survived. Yet the inquest, while dramatic, produced no new certainty. It was only afterwards, in the hushed chatter outside the hall, that new whispers began to circulate. Whispers Miss Marple was careful to listen to a will, and a surprise the first whisper came from Dolly Bantry herself, who had picked it up from the innkeeper's wife. It seems, Dolly confided over their tea, that Mr. Cresswell had recently made a new will, left a tidy sum to a young woman, not a relative. Nobody seems to know who she is." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "A young woman, you say? How very interesting." A mysterious beneficiary was always a signpost, though not necessarily to the obvious conclusion. A young woman might be a companion, a protégé, or, indeed, someone with leverage over him. Miss Harding's tension later that day, Miss Marple made another visit to the bookshop. She found Miss Harding alone, sorting through a pile of invoices. "It is difficult, with the inspector coming and going," Miss Harding admitted in a low tone. "Mr. Frobisher is beside himself, and I do all the practical work. It is not easy to keep the shop running when everyone whispers murder." Miss Marple sympathized gently, but her eyes observed keenly. Miss Harding's hands shook slightly as she handled the papers, and when Miss Marple asked, as if innocently, whether she had known Mr. Cresswell previously, Miss Harding froze for the briefest second before answering. "I had met him, yes, once, in London, a booksellers' gathering." The pause spoke volumes. Miss Marple tucked the detail away. Colonel Arbuthnot's tale that evening. At the inn, Colonel Arbuthnot held court in the parlour, regaling anyone who would listen with his theories. "Mark my words," he boomed. Cresswell was about to expose Frobisher for fraud. Fellow was terrified, I tell you. I saw it myself, the way he went pale whenever Cresswell opened his mouth. Poison, child's play for a man desperate enough. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively nearby, allowed the colonel to bluster. But when she asked whether he had been near the curtain at the crucial moment, he grew uncharacteristically vague. "Well, dash it all, one moves about, doesn't one?" Looking at the display. "I might have been there, or thereabouts, but it proves nothing." Which, Miss Marple thought, was precisely the sort of thing a man says when trying not to admit where he was. Mrs. Prowse's gossip. The following morning, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Prowse outside the church. The vicar's wife, flushed with self-importance, leaned closer. "My dear Miss Marple, you won't repeat this, but I have it on good authority that Cresswell was not the gentleman he pretended to be. There was some scandal in London of forgery, or something of that sort. I dare say he made enemies everywhere." Miss Marple listened, nodding gravely. Gossip was rarely accurate, but often it hinted at truths better concealed. Forgery, debts, scandal, any of these might supply a motive for others to silence Cresswell. The unexpected visitor that afternoon. A stranger arrived in St. Mildred's, a young woman, smartly dressed, with an air of independence. She checked into the Swan Inn and gave her name as Clara Cresswell, a niece, she explained, though nobody had heard of her before. Miss Marple was intrigued. Clara confirmed that she was indeed the mysterious beneficiary of her uncle's will. He wanted to make amends, she told the inspector when questioned. He had neglected family ties. "I was his late brother's daughter." It was plausible, yet Miss Marple, observing the girl's self-possession, wondered whether it was the whole truth. Clara's eyes were sharp, her voice combat. There was no grief in her manner. The clue of the glass Inspector Craddock shared his frustrations with Miss Marple that evening, as they met outside the bookshop. "I cannot fix it, Miss Marple. The poison was in a glass, but nobody admits to offering Cresswell a drink. The others swear he helped himself, and yet the glass was not his own. Frobisher says it came from the back room." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "When people deny offering a drink, Inspector, it may be not because they did not, but because they fear how it looks. One must always consider human pride as well as guilt." Craddock sighed. "I rather thought you'd say something like that, a false lead." The next day, dramatic news shook the village. Colonel Arbuthnot was discovered to have purchased cyanide from the chemist a fortnight earlier, ostensibly for destroying garden pests. At once, tongues wagged and suspicions flared. Of course, it was the colonel, Mrs. Prowse declared. "I knew it all along." Loud voices are often guilty voices, but Miss Marple, far from being convinced, pursed her lips. "I have known many gentlemen who purchase cyanide for wasps or moles, and I have also known that the most obvious suspects are rarely the true ones. Indeed, when questioned, the colonel produced receipts and even the half-empty tin, complete with instructions in his own handwriting. It was too neat, Miss Marple thought, far too neat." A quiet reflection that evening, in the comfort of Dolly Bantry's sitting room. Miss Marple reflected aloud as she knitted. There are curious little patterns. Dolly, a curtain drawn when none was needed, a glass that belonged to the back room, not the counter. an assistant who trembles when asked about a past acquaintance, and now a young woman who arrives with a will and no grief. Dolly shivered with delight. "Oh, Jane, it's just like one of those detective novels." Miss Marple smiled, but her eyes were grave. "Real life, Dolly, is much tedious, but one learns, after many years, that human hearts repeat themselves as much as book plots, and I think, very soon, one of those little hearts will betray its secret." The fire crackled in the grate. Outside, the autumn wind rustled the leaves, and inside, Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, as though keeping time with the unfolding mystery. Inspector Craddock was not a man easily ruffled, but by the fourth day he looked as though the entire weight of St. Mildred's gossip sat squarely upon his shoulders. He had interviewed and re-interviewed the principal witnesses, examined bottles and glasses, and tramped the high street until the cobblestones seemed etched upon his boots. Yet the case remained stubbornly elusive. Miss Marple, however, was not discouraged. She knew from long experience that crimes of this kind often appeared muddled until, with the turn of a single thread, the entire skein unraveled, and it was with that quiet certainty that she set about her own form of investigation: gentle conversations, patient listening, and, above all, careful remembrance of the little things. The curtain again. It was Dolly Bantry, in her lively and unfiltered way, who unwittingly provided the nudge Miss Marple required. "My dear Jane," she exclaimed over breakfast, "I cannot see why everyone makes such a fuss about that curtain. It was just there for show, wasn't it, to give the whole thing a bit of drama?" Miss Marple looked up from her boiled egg with mild surprise. "For show, Dolly, but whose show?" She let the question hang in the air. Dolly, distracted by her toast, did not pursue it, but Miss Marple's mind was already at work. Curtains could conceal as well as dramatize. Someone had thought carefully about the arrangement of that alcove, and it was no accident that the death occurred there, in the one place where sightlines were obscured. But Miss Harding's passed later that morning. Miss Marple contrived to meet Miss Harding again, this time under the pretext of inquiring after a gardening manual. The assistant fetched the book mechanically, her face pale in the shop's half-light. Miss Marple, with her air of innocent chatter, remarked, "London is such a busy place for a country girl. I dare say you did not find it much to your taste when you visited before." Miss Harding started, then coloured faintly. "I was in London for some months, Miss Marple. My mother was ill, and I sought work there. Mr. Cresswell, I had encountered him at that time. He was not kind." There was a weight in those words that spoke of something more personal than mere professional slight. Miss Marple did not press her, but in her mind a piece clicked into place. Resentment, humiliation, perhaps even a threat of exposure. It would not have been the first time such wounds led to desperate action. Frobisher's denials. Meanwhile, Mr. Frobisher had grown increasingly agitated, pacing his shop as though pursued by invisible creditors. When Miss Marple gently suggested that Cresswell had been threatening to expose supposed forgeries, the man's protest was so vehement that it verged on hysteria. "They were genuine, I tell you, genuine," he cried, sweat upon his brow. "He was lying, trying to blackmail me, to ruin me. But I did not kill him, Miss Marple, I did not." It was a curious choice of words, Miss Marple thought, noting the repetition. People in fear often proclaimed innocence before they were accused. She had seen it many times in St. Mary Mead, when stolen geranium cuttings or pilfered cream found their way into village disputes. The niece's curiosity, Clara Cresswell, the mysterious niece, proved equally intriguing. She was not shy about her inheritance, nor did she feign sorrow for her uncle. When Miss Marple encountered her in the tea-room, Clara was perusing the Times with a look of calm satisfaction. "You must find village life rather slow after London," Miss Marple remarked, settling herself with tea and scone. Clara smiled faintly. "On the contrary, Miss Marple, I find it highly diverting. One sees so many peculiarities when tragedy strikes. People reveal more of themselves than they know." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. There was something too assured about the young woman, as though she observed rather than mourned. And yet, Miss Marple reminded herself, youth often disguised grief with composure. Still, the girl's arrival had been very timely indeed. The Colonel's defensiveness. Colonel Arbuthnot, meanwhile, continued to bluster. When confronted again about his purchase of cyanide, he flared up indignantly. "Garden pests, dash it all. I've the blasted receipts. You don't think I'd be fool enough to poison a man and leave a trail straight to the chemist, do you?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her voice remained mild. "Indeed, Colonel, only the very foolish would do such a thing. But then, not everyone is wise in a moment of passion." His mustache bristled, but he offered no more. A key realization that evening, Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting by the fire at the Swan Inn. Her thoughts ran in delicate loops. Not unlike the patterns of her wool, she thought again of the glass, not Cresswell's own, but fetched from the back. That suggested intent. Someone had procured a particular glass, placed in a particular spot, and who, in the bustle of the shop, would know precisely where such items were kept. Not a guest, not a colonel, nor a vicar's wife. Only those who lived and breathed the shop's routine. Her mind returned to Miss Harding. The girl's tremor, her veiled allusion to a painful encounter in London, her fierce devotion to Mr. Frobisher. Devotion could sometimes lead to sacrifice and to desperate acts in protection of another's reputation. But was Harding protecting Frobisher or herself? And then Miss Marple recalled something so simple it almost seemed trivial. Mrs. Prowse's comment that the curtain was unnecessary, almost as though someone wanted a hidden corner. Indeed, a hidden corner for what? For a body to fall, unnoticed, or for a hand to slip poison into a glass unobserved. Preparing the scene, the pattern was there now, faint but visible. Miss Marple knew she could not yet accuse without proof, but proof, in her experience, was often best gathered by letting the guilty actor speak too much. She sent a note, polite and unassuming, inviting Mr. Frobisher, Miss Harding, Colonel Arbuthnot, Mrs. Prowse, and Clara Cresswell to gather once more in the bookshop that coming evening, under the pretext of assisting the inspector with a reconstruction. Dolly Bantry, delighted by the drama, agreed to accompany her. When Inspector Craddock heard of this plan, he looked at Miss Marple with weary admiration. "You mean to flush them out, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled demurely. "Oh, Inspector, I am far too old to be flushing anything. But sometimes a cat will watch by the mousehole, and the mouse, thinking itself safe, will betray its scurrying." Craddock shook his head, but agreed. He had learned that where Miss Marple watched, truth often followed. The stage is set, and so as dusk fell and the lamps of St. Mildred's flickered to life, the bookshop once again filled with its familiar cast of characters. The curtain still hung in its alcove, the rare volumes glimmered under glass, and the air was heavy with expectation. Miss Marple sat in her accustomed chair, knitting in hand, her eyes mild yet piercing. Around her, the suspects gathered, uneasy and defensive. It was time, she knew, for the final threads to be drawn together. Soon, very soon, the truth behind the bookshop curtain would be revealed. The bookshop felt curiously claustrophobic that evening, as though the dark oak shelves themselves leaned forward to hear what would be said. The little company assembled in uneasy silence. Mr. Frobisher with his twitching hands, Miss Harding pale but composed, Colonel Arbuthnot blustering beneath his mustache, Mrs. Prowse primly perched with an air of righteous expectation, and Clara Cresswell coolly detached, her fashionable hat tilted just so. Inspector Craddock stood with arms folded, though his glance rested more than once upon Miss Marple, who sat serenely in her chair by the counter, knitting needles clicking. The fire crackled faintly, and outside the bell of St. Mildred's struck the hour. "My dear friends," Miss Marple began in her gentle voice, "I asked you to gather here because there remain certain confusions, I believe, which can now be resolved." She paused, letting her words settle. The suspects shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Prowse pursed her lips, as though already composing a triumphant account for the vicar. "The difficulty," Miss Marple continued, "lies in that glass, the glass from the back room, found overturned near Mr. Cresswell. A curious matter. Why not one of the ordinary tumblers kept upon the counter? Why fetch a glass from further in?" She looked around mildly, her eyes resting for a moment on Miss Harding. "The answer, I think, is that the person who fetched it knew exactly where it would be found, which narrows matters considerably." Mr. Frobisher gave a strangled cough. "Do you mean you suggest that I—" Miss Marple raised a placating hand. "Patience, Mr. Frobisher. The truth is seldom so simple as we first imagine. You see, it is not only the glass but the curtain that interests me. A curtain drawn when none was needed, except perhaps to create a little stage, or more pertinently, to provide concealment." Colonel Arbuthnot barked. "Dash it all, Miss Marple, what are you implying?" "Merely that while all eyes were upon the rare books, One person could stand behind that curtain, unseen, and pour a measure into a waiting glass. And when Mr. Cresswell reached for a tar, but that is the point, he did not reach for it by chance. It had been placed for him. A murmur ran through the group. Mrs. Prowse gave a little gasp. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Mr. Cresswell was not a man to pass up a glass offered with apparent courtesy, and offered it was though not openly. A little nudge, a word, perhaps even a smile, enough to guide him to the poisoned draught. And who, we may ask, had both the opportunity and the knowledge of where to find such a glass? Her gaze rested squarely now upon Miss Harding. The young woman's lips parted, then closed again. Colour drained from her face. Inspector Craddock leaned forward. "Are you accusing Miss Harding, Miss Marple?" But Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Accusing is such a strong word, Inspector. Let us say rather that the evidence points, with quiet insistence, in her direction. Miss Harding, you encountered Mr. Cresswell before, in London. He belittled you, did he not? Humiliated you. And here he returned, threatening once again, this time not only yourself, but Mr. Frobisher's livelihood as well. A cruel man, ready to destroy reputations." Miss Harding's hands trembled upon the counter. He would have ruined everything," she whispered. "He said he would expose Mr. Frobisher as a fraud, and me," as she broke off, biting her lip. Miss Marple nodded kindly. "Yes, my dear, and so, out of fear and loyalty, or perhaps out of desperation, you slipped the poison into the glass, believing it was justice of a kind." There was a long silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. At last Miss Harding straightened, her face pale but resolute. "Yes," she said quietly, "I did it. He had mocked me, threatened me, treated me as nothing, and I could not bear to see Mr. Frobisher destroyed as well. He is a good man. He did not deserve it." Mr. Frobisher gave a choked sob, covering his face with his hands. Mrs. Prowse predictably exclaimed, "I knew it all along," though no one paid her the slightest attention. Inspector Craddock sighed heavily. "Well, Miss Harding, you've spared us a great deal of trouble by admitting it, but you understand the consequences." The young woman bowed her head. "Yes, I understand." Aftermath. The following morning, the village of St. Mildred's buzzed with more gossip than ever before, though it was tinged now with pity as well. As shock, Miss Harding was taken into custody, her confession sealing the matter. Mr. Frobisher, devastated, declared he would close the bookshop, though Miss Marple suspected time would soften his resolve. Colonel Arbuthnot, though privately relieved at his own exoneration, continued to mutter that cyanide should be restricted to military use. Mrs. Prowse, meanwhile, ensured that every corner of the parish knew that she had been instrumental in the discovery. Clara Cresswell departed on the afternoon train, her inheritance secure, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple reflected that the girl had revealed more by what she had not said than by what she had. Still, the young are often inscrutable, and Miss Marple did not press the matter. Miss Marple reflects that evening. Miss Marple and Dolly Bantry sat together by the inn's fire. Dolly, still flushed with excitement, could not contain herself. "Oh, Jane, how perfectly splendid! You saw it, all the glass, the curtain, the past in London. How do you do it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles working steadily at a small white shawl. "It is not so very clever, Dolly. One sees the same things again and again in village life. A glass misplaced, a curtain drawn, a young woman's pride injured. It is all quite familiar, only writ upon a larger stage. Human nature repeats itself endlessly. One only has to remember." Dolly shook her head in admiration. "Still, I shall never step into a bookshop again without peering behind the curtains." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "That may be wise, my dear. One never knows what might be hidden." Closing outside, the autumn wind rattled the window panes, and the church bell tolled softly in the distance. Within, Miss Marple sat serenely, the firelight glinting upon her knitting needles. Another mystery had ended, not with noise or drama, but with the quiet unravelling of threads by an elderly lady whose eyes missed nothing. And so the village of St. Mildred's, shaken by murder behind the bookshop curtain, began to return to its gentle routines. Gardens tended, tea poured, and gossip renewed, while Miss Jane Marple, with her mild smile and quiet wisdom, reflected once more that no setting, however quaint, was ever entirely safe from the darker chapters of the human heart.